Cheryl is an assistant professor at Ryerson, and as well as an author and instructor on, I feel like I should let you do a little bit of your own introduction. It's great.
You're doing such a good job. Continue.
She's a professor on Black Canadian Studies, as well as consumer culture, visual culture, celebrity, and there's one more.
Well, I'm now in the School of Creative Industries,
yes.
So I teach those courses.
And she's also an author for many publications, including Spacing, Rabble, Montreal Gazette, Toronto Star. So we are really excited to have her with us tonight.
Thank you.
And I'll turn it over to you.
Okay. Yes, thank you for turning it over to me. I guess, should I introduce both Maggie and John? Okay, so here's Maggie Hutcheson. I have your bio here. Let me get it right. I won't ramble on too long. First of all, it's really great to be here tonight because I think the conversation that I hope that we have is one that I think many people have been having, and I think it's kind of at a moment in time when people are interested in memory and space and how we think about heritage. So Maggie Hutcheson, here to my left, is a community-engaged artist, arts consultant and educator for over 15 years. She's collaborated with other artists and Toronto residents to animate oral histories of war, gentrification, homelessness, migration, and community organizing. Maggie has worked with a range of arts and non-arts organizations, including the CBC, Toronto War Museum, Jubilee's Theatre, Mabel Arts?
Mabel Arts.
Yeah, Mabel Arts, Toronto Arts Foundation, and York University. She is also the artistic director of the award-winning arts collective Department of Public Memory. She also authored the Ontario Arts Council's recently published handbook on best practices in community-engaged art, has extensive teaching experience, and holds a PhD in environmental studies. Maggie was also the lead curator of the Toronto War Museum's Block by Block project in 2017. And John is a Toronto-based journalist and editor. He writes about urban affairs, a lot about city politics, business and local history for various media, including Globe and Mail, Toronto Star, Walrus, and Spacing, where he is senior editor. John is also the Toronto nonfiction editor for Coach House Books and co-editor of the recently released anthology, The Ward Uncovered, The Archeology of Everyday Life. I am also in that book. Get that book. So today we're basically here to talk about this discussion about the stories of our city. And so before we get into this discussion, me asking Maggie and John questions, I just kind of want to set up where this whole thing came from. So I remember a few weeks ago I met with Ali and we discussed sort of how we think about storytelling and how we think about storytelling as it relates to heritage. And then how we think of that as it relates to places and buildings and all the things that make up our individual and collective memories of being in Toronto, being Torontonians. Like, what does it mean? And sort of at the same time, how we contend with change. So what happens when you're living in a neighborhood and suddenly that building that you've always seen is gone and it's replaced with something else? What does that mean? Should we always look at that in terms of loss of something, or does that mean something is being gained? Because that leaves room for something new to come in. And when something new does come in, does that now mean that certain memories are lost, or people feel displaced or less connected to their communities? Or does it just mean that the community has changed and maybe we have to change along with it, right? So some of these tensions are not just about buildings or places, we're really talking about identity, right? And we're talking about identification. So how people identify with the places where they live and the people that they then associate with those places. Because as buildings change, that means the people who now go into those communities are going to change. And so how do we then grapple with those changes in terms of the stories that we tell about those places? And for me, when people hear storytelling, I mean, I just feel like everyone has a different conception of what that is. Some people go back to their childhood where someone's just going to sit there and tell you a story and like entertain you for a set time. But for me, a story is really about sort of I always think of it as a triangle between memory, feelings, like feeling good, or not about a story, but also a place. Like stories are always set in a certain place and at a certain time, and they take us somewhere, right? So what I'm hoping in this conversation about stories is that we get taken somewhere, whether it be what we're saying or the things that you're thinking about the places and spaces where we live in Toronto. So that's just a little backdrop to it. So the first question that we sort of want to get into is sort of this idea of why should Toronto care about stories as it relates to heritage and places and spaces. And I want to add to that, not just Toronto, and obviously the people in this room, they're here, obviously you care, but why should Torontonians actually see this as something that they should care about? Either one of you.
Okay. I mean, so much of my work has been about story. How could we not care? This is everything. It's everything, and it's everything to do with how we build our cities and who we are. But I think stories are a way to. They're kind of a signpost of, where are we? They're a way to share our experiences, to have a shared sense of where we are and who we are that goes beyond our own experience of the city. So I think a lot as I move through Toronto, and I grew up in Toronto, but I think a lot as I move through about how different my memoryscape of Toronto is from that of other people. My mother was what they call a red diaper baby. She grew up, her parents were communist organizers, members of the Communist Party in Toronto. So she has a really idiosyncratic memoryscape of Toronto. So for example, University Avenue for her is where she marched as a very young child before the Rosenbergs were executed. So they were American communists who were accused of espionage and were publicly executed in the States. So that's like a very dramatic strip. University Avenue may not be what most people think of. For her, the rail lines, the CPR rail lines are where she and her brothers late at night would hang political banners. Again, quite a strange memory of that place.
It sounds like you had an amazing childhood, though.
Well, yes, that wasn't my childhood. I mean, that was her childhood, but
But she didn't impart that on you, I think.
Well, she did, and yeah, I mean, I grew up around my maternal grandparents, so I have this, yes, I guess I grew up with quite a strange, a different memoryscape of Toronto, but that's also led me to the kind of work I do and realizing that, of course, we all have different memoryscapes of Toronto, and they're very, they're shaped both by our kind of personal histories, but also by big social categories like gender and race and class. We're all moving through, we may think we all live in the same city or the same neighborhood, but we're actually moving through quite different cities, I think. So I guess that's one way to come back to saying that I think stories are a way to move outside of our own experience of a city or a place and start to have that dialogue and develop some kind of shared sense of where we are. Yeah, I'll leave it there, but that's one answer to that question.
I grew up in North Toronto, and the stories that I was told when I was a kid took place in rural Hungary in the 1930s, which is where my parents come from Hungary and left in '56 during the revolution. And so right away there's kind of this juncture, although it didn't feel like that when I was a kid. And as I reflect on your question, and been writing about this, the thing that defines Toronto is that there are so many people from so many other places, right? It's a city that's constantly replenishing itself. And so the notion that there's shared memory about the city is, it's like pretty thin, right? Because most people come from somewhere else. And when I say most, like 51% of the resident population of Greater Toronto was born outside of Canada. So the question is, like, how do you, what is shared memory in an urban space like that, where people's sort of mental geography goes to all over the world, and to events that have nothing to do with Toronto, so where do you find, what's the common denominator there? And the second thing I'll say is that, so I'm really interested in the city's history. I'm interested in the city's immigration history, although my interest in Toronto's history my parents had a couple of picture books. One was by Mike Filey, of old, picture books of old Toronto, which I really enjoyed looking through when I was a kid. And there was one picture that was taken not far from the public library where I used to go, but it's like completely unrecognizable because it's like a rural road, and it's, there's like, wooden shack there. And I remember looking at this picture thinking, how does that place become the place that I know? So I was interested in that, that continuum, and then now in my professional life, I'm interested in the stories of the city's past. But the question that I don't really have a good answer to is how do you feel connected to a past that you're not really connected to, right? So my family's past goes back to late December of 1956, before which, I think my parents didn't even know that Toronto existed. And so why should I feel an affinity to to this time before December of 1956? And so, so some of that has to do with an appreciation of what happened here, how the city comes together, how, the past, helps create this present that we're in now, so.
And I mean, do you think, one of the critiques, I guess, of millennials, not to pick on millennials, no, is that they seem to not care about history, right? They think, who cares about a building that's no longer there? That's not my, I feel like I meet a lot of young people who are like, well, that's not my story, right? Like, that has nothing to do with me, that kind of attitude. Like, how is it important to shift that attitude, or to say, well, should we honor that maybe they don't care, and maybe that's okay that they don't care, or do we need to make them, this whole impetus of people need to love history, and obviously if that's what you do, you love it, but what can you do when there's just that apathy among a whole generation who doesn't seem to care as much as maybe you do or your parents did?
Yeah. I mean, I have not come at this as a historian. I've really come at it through oral history and through being quite interested in contemporary stories, which then take me back into history. So for me, I can't speak for what millennials are looking for per se, but for me, what will make me remember, I see a part of Toronto differently, or remember a certain part of Toronto's history, is when I hear a story that makes me feel something, that actually, lets me imagine and empathize, and imagine somebody's experience and hear it from them, and put that into dialogue somehow with my own experiences ultimately. Right. So I think that's what in the community arts work that I've done, or with my collective department of public memory, where we host public memory sharing events at certain sites in the city, that's what we're trying to do. It's always an experiment of how do you actually get into, how do you get these stories into someone else's memory state. But I know that having listened to other people's stories through all of this work, I do actually have a very different sense of the city's history now than I would have. They have become part of my own memories now. So that's what you hope for. And I think there are a lot of incredible artists and really, all sorts of interesting walking tours, artists, new museums, etc., who are doing creative work around that are making people feel that the history does pertain to them. Whether or not they grew up in Toronto or in Canada.
Right.
So I think that, and I have to respect this, that some people have a greater sense of history and historical thinking than others, and just like, some people have more sense of math than others. It's a difference, and I'm comfortable with that. I think some of it has to do with the way history is taught and presented to young people. Like I personally am interested in sort of capital H history, right? Like, about the big events, but I think I can understand why it's not relatable. I think for me it's relatable because, my parents survived the Holocaust, and, so they were subjected to a lot of history, and so, so I kind of had that in the household. But, I find that the interesting, and I think this is really sort of more current idea that social history, which was not really well respected among historians and history teachers, is sort of having its kind of moment in the sun. And the notion of microhistories and the notion of taking individual lives that are not sort of generals and politicians, but ordinary people, and sort of connecting their experiences and stories to something bigger is a way of sort of reaching through and conveying things differently. It's not a plug for my book, but we did this anthology about this archaeological dig in this parking lot that was just up the street, and one of the stories that emerges from that, all the archaeology that was done there.
You're talking about the ward uncovered.
The ward uncovered.
You gotta plug it,
Yeah.
right? The ward uncovered. Archeology of every
Cheryl's
day.
post. So this was it was a parking lot for 60 years, and it's going to be a big courthouse, and there was a mandate to excavate and find all the archaeological items, and there was 500,000 artifacts were found in this parking lot, and a lot of research was done around those artifacts, and so stories like this emerged. So there's a woman who lived at 15 Center Avenue around the turn of the century. She was a bootlegger, and she was a widow, and she was of Irish descent. And she was arrested fairly frequently, and if you read the newspaper accounts, she seemed like she was a fairly hot-tempered person. When the way archaeology works is you do a first pass by doing all this sort of archival work, and then you start digging and you see what you find. So the archaeologists were able to kind of identify where her house was, because they were looking at who was living where, and sort of piece together aspects of her life, who she was married to, when she died, all of these things. And then discovered, when they started digging under where her house was, a whole stash of empty bottles. And her life is interesting. Like she does not figure in any way in the official history of the city. But this is a woman who was widowed and who had to kind of make do. And she had to make do at a time when the powers that be were very unfriendly towards alcohol consumption of any sort. So she was in this kind of dynamic against the police and against the local council. So her story, while it's not a capital H history story, relates to something bigger, and I think is therefore relatable.
Yeah, I mean, it makes you wonder what happened to all the alcohol with the empty bottles.
Yeah.
It's a random comment. Anyway, the next question.
There were no courts.
It's interesting because if you travel to other cities, like there's so many other cities around the world that have these great stories attached to them. And I always think of like New York, right? New York has such a story, the skyline. Brooklyn, now when it's like Brooklyn, you don't even know what that means anymore. You just know that it means something, right? So I'm wondering if either of you want to just talk a bit about sort of what Toronto, like the story that is attached to Toronto, like what is that? Like do we have a story that's attached to the city, you think?
My sense is that we're finding all of our stories, that we're in this real moment where we're finding our many stories, which, as John said, connect far beyond our borders, our city's border and our country's border as well.
Like you think that's just happening?
I think I do think that we're in a moment where an awareness that Toronto and Torontonians have interesting stories. We're in a moment where that's, where we're starting to understand that through lots of initiatives, including spacing and Jane's Walks,
Right.
and Museum, which is a new museum, Toronto Ward Museum, and lots of publications, and a lot of artists doing interesting walking tours themselves as well, or performances in space. I really think we're in a moment where we're starting to realize we have interesting stories. I don't think that was true 20 years ago. My sense is that people thought of Toronto as having a relatively short and uninteresting history until that time. So I think right now, it seems to me that we're in a moment where we realize our stories are all around us, they're everywhere. Whether we have found some kind of, and I don't even know if we need to, but whether we found some kind of collective story about what Toronto is or who we are.
I mean, aren't we the sixth now?
I don't know. I don't know if we have, maybe we don't want to entirely.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's an interesting question.
So I would answer the question this way, that like cities like New York and Paris and London have like a huge head start, right? So, I mean, New York is a 400 or 500-year-old city with, you know, there are periods where there are its own stories, and you know, New York has this concentration, this ability to, you know, sort of mythologize. And so Toronto is a very young city in that respect. There are other structural points which I think have worked against the consciousness of the city's narrative. One is the enthusiasm with which the older parts of the city were kind of demolished in the post-war era. So there was a, you know, and that is not unique to Toronto. I mean, there was a great push to modernize. Lots of cities, lots of older buildings were demolished, and you know, there was this pushback that began in New York in the 60s. But we, you know, I mean, I'm sure many of you have seen, and they're quite remarkable to me to look at pictures around St. Lawrence in the 70s, and like it's all parking lots, right? Everything got knocked down. So I mentioned the buildings not because buildings themselves have value, they have architectural value, but they're kind of acute in memory, which I think, you know, it allows them to be part of that process of awareness of, you know, why things are the way they are. And then the second thing, this is, so I have no quantitative proof about this, but I have an acquaintance who is a former dean of arts and science at the University of Toronto, Scarborough, a guy named Hutcheson, and he's an American historian, he's a social historian, labor historian, and we were talking, he's a neighbor, and he said that in the 70s and 80s, the way to success for young historians in Canada was to go to the big national political histories, right? And so municipal, local histories and social histories were not emphasized in the world of academia. So academic writing is kind of like foundational, right? Because it provides information for other things and other ways. So there is actually that gap. And I know this personally as a journalist because when I have to go look for stuff about, you know, periods in Toronto's past, because it's something I'm writing, there are some big gaps, right? There's some places where you just don't find anything at all.
Try looking for Black history.
Yeah, and and you know, immigration history. There's like all sorts of gaps, and this is why I think that, you know, I mean, the Ward books have been very successful because there's a hunger for that. So lots of people have those experiences, and that's a common experience, but it's just not really present in the scholarship. So.
If I can just add to that, you know, that's exactly, so I'm part of an art collective called Department of Public Memory. We've been making, since 2011, we've been making commemorative signs to mark public infrastructure that we think is overlooked, and kind of bring to life the stories from inside buildings, like public health buildings, for example, or daycares. You know, how was this social infrastructure created? Like, who built this? And really, the reason we've then developed a whole methodology around oral history. We've done all of this original oral history research because the stories weren't written. They just simply weren't there, which led to, you know, a very interesting process that's now reinforced my love of oral history. But really, it was because we couldn't find anything written about any of these sites, and this includes, you know, the first publicly funded daycare in all of Canada. Well, where's the story of that? So, anyway.
Yeah, and I mean, the reason I make that comment about Black history is, you know, I spent 2 years at the University of Toronto I held a Banting postdoctoral fellowship where I was working on looking at the performance of black-faced minstrelsy in the community. So the performance of blackface outside the traditional theater, in like the community center and at the church group and the high school and all these places. And people would be like, oh, they had those things in those places? I'm like, yeah, and if you actually go back in your memory, if you're a certain age, you might actually remember them, right? So I'm interested in that gap. And what I've realized in all historical work is that it's not a matter of these things not having taken place or that they didn't happen. it's that we just move on and we put them in the box, put it in the basement, and then we just leave it there, right? And I think cities, the memory of cities sometimes work like that too, right? We just move on and we just leave it there. And we forget that these things used to happen and be a part of the cultural fabric, which I think is kind of something you want to remember when every Halloween, in my case, they say, oh, look, they're doing that again. Why do they keep doing that? Well, because we used to do that on a regular basis. And it's still in the ether, is what I'm saying. So these things don't really leave our memory, they just stay. And I think it's the same thing with heritage, it's the same thing with all these things, they just kind of stick around, and we can never really place them until people come around, like you guys, I guess kind of myself do, and we try to place them. And I think that's just interesting. So the next question I have here is, how can we use different understandings of sites and areas in Toronto to broaden our interpretation of the city? And I think what I really mean in asking that question is, you know, a lot of times when people think of Toronto, what do they think of? That we're a collection of neighborhoods. That we're not really this cohesive city as we like to think we are, but we're just, you know, Bathurst and Bloor and Queen West and all these places. How can we sort of make sense of all these different understandings, different sites and places, and just make that something that people can interpret as being part of Toronto's interesting kind of narrative, do you know what I mean? As opposed to seeing it as, again, it kind of ties into the first question, as opposed to seeing it as a problem that we have to overcome, to have this like central story that we keep telling ourselves that makes us Torontonians.
Yeah. Okay, I don't know if this entirely answers your question, but
Go
I'm
for it,
going to
go
try
for
it. So again, this work that I've been doing with my project Department of Public Memory, what we've ended up doing is focusing, so all of our storytelling builds out of a specific site, one at a time. So for example, a municipal daycare that's recently built, we start to dig into that story, and a whole kind of history of organizing around daycare comes out of that one site. And part of our work, I'll explain why this ties in, but part of the work, you know, so we're gathering oral histories of that site, but then branching off of that into histories of daycare workers, and we start to interview people who worked in historical daycares, and then we start to speak with parents who were advocating for daycare throughout various generations, et cetera, et cetera. When we come to, what we do then is we unveil a commemorative sign. We always host what we call a memory sharing event, which is a big public event that people can come to, and we hold it on the site. And what I find interesting about those events, so we both kind of curate the speakers and people share memories and some of the stories, and we thought about how we want to present the story, but we always have an open microphone as well. What's really interesting about starting with one site is people, it democratizes the storytelling to a certain extent, because everybody can pick up on some form of information just in being on the site in the first place.
Right.
You know, what do you see around you? Okay, there's major development happening here. There's a daycare down the street. Oh, this, you know, what I know of Kensington Market neighborhood is X, Y, and Z. People start to bring in their own knowledge. So I found that very interesting working at a specific site, even just starting with allowing people to bring in the knowledge they have just through their senses of the site, and then starting to tap in. So I guess that's one answer. I don't know if there are particular sites that would make us feel like we were united as Toronto per se. So maybe you can think of some, I don't know. But I think starting with a site is just, it's quite infinite what people can bring in terms of their own. You know, everybody always says, oh, I don't have stories to tell. My story's not interesting. I don't have a story to tell. But
That's such a Canadian
when
thing.
you start with a place and you start to ask certain questions, everyone has stories to tell, and it's just how you start to tap into that. I think places are a great way to do that,
Right.
specific places.
Well, I think that, sort of coming at it slightly differently, like, so you could ask the question, what's the value of storytelling of this form?
Yeah.
And I think that one answer, sort of picks up on what you said, is that you know, it creates a basis for communication and connection with people you don't necessarily know, right? So I write for a living. You know, the vast majority of people who read what I write, I don't need. But you know, but I have had this experience where I do lots of walking tours of the ward, and there's nothing to see in the ward except for a handful of buildings. But invariably, people will show up and they say, my grandparents lived in the ward, or, you know, I had some connection. And so then you get that sort of back and forth. And I think that the, you know, in an example like yours, what it does is it basically creates a stronger social fabric. And the enemy of healthy city is when everybody is in their own thing and it's just atomizing. And, you know, you have stronger, more cohesive, healthier neighborhoods where people are connected in different ways. And that happens in lots of different ways. It happens, you know, when you know, lots of different people go to the kids' musical at the school, right? I mean, there are lots of ways that those connections happen, but this is one of those ways. And it doesn't necessarily have to be about history and about the backstory. But the backstory is interesting, and it can be a way of connecting. So, like, this is a really small one. Like, you know, it's a sort of a weird example. But so I write occasionally for this proudly Luddite publication called the West End Phoenix, and which was founded by the musician Dave Bedini about a year and a half ago. And they recently had a piece about how Levon Helm, who was in the band, lived in an apartment, like in a rooming house on Arlington Avenue around Christie and St. Clair. It's like right around the corner from my house. And I thought, oh wow, that's amazing, because you know, like the band and Levon Helm lived in this house that I walk by literally every day. And so, you know, so I saw my neighbors who live in that house, and I didn't really know them, but you know, we sort of say hello, and one day they came out, I said, I have to tell you this story. So I told them, and they went, oh wow, that's amazing. And it was just like a way of, you know, sort of connecting with somebody in your neighborhood, a very simple thing. It happened in lots of different ways, but in this case, that was the vehicle that allowed that connection to take place, and I'm happy because I know somebody else in my neighborhood now, so.
I mean, it makes me think of, it's interesting because while I live in Toronto today, I really am from Scarborough. And I make that distinction even today when people ask me, like, oh, where are you from? It's like, well, I grew up in Scarborough, but I live here now. And it's funny, even though it's 416, like we are one city, I still consider it to be something different. Like, it's a different place, it's a different site, it has nothing to do with this, and I don't know why I still do, but I can't not do that. And it's interesting, I say that because whenever I meet people in the city from Scarborough, it's like we're instant friends. Like, I feel like, is this some Scarborough people?
So,
right?
like
We're gonna be friends. And I remember I worked in a company where this talk about stories, so I'll tell you one. So I was not always an academic, I started as an insurance adjuster, that is true. And we were in a meeting, like it wasn't a meeting, it was like orientation, and there were 12 of us, and we all started at the same time, 12 of us. And then we went around the room, and everyone had to introduce themselves and say where they were from. So everyone did that, and then there was one person in the room who, his name was Peter, and Peter was Korean, and Peter was from Scarborough. Me and Peter became best friends, like literally after the lunch. For no other reason than he was from Scarborough, but it's like we knew each other. And when I say that is, it's interesting about places because we knew each other. We spoke the same language, if that makes sense. We had the same references. And I think what separates, you know, I can only speak from my own experience, one of the things I found now that I live in Toronto that is so different than Scarborough is that in Scarborough, that's a fact. Like if I go to, say, Cedar Brae Mall, it's like I'm with my people. It doesn't matter what happens, it's like we're all sharing a brain, and we're all gonna react to things in a similar way. Something happens on the Queen car, and I don't know what's gonna happen. It's like we're dealing with, like there isn't that same sense of oneness about who we are as a people and how we're gonna respond to this. It's literally like anything can happen. Whereas I'm in Scarborough, say I'm on the Markham Road bus, I know exactly what's gonna happen, and everyone will act the same way. And so I guess this is a convoluted question, roundabout way question to say, like, isn't that part of what it's like to be a Torontonian too? Is this weird sense of not speaking the same intuitive languages around certain spaces and places, as opposed to in places that have a kind of I can even think of like Etobicoke North is kind of like this too. While it's framed in this negative way, you meet anyone from Jane and Finch and they're like the same. Like they think the same. They have a rhythm. So what I'm saying to you is that it's part of being the Toronto that we think of, this kind of, I don't know if dysrhythm is the right word, but sort of a lack of rhythm. Like not a lack in a negative sense, but a lack of this cohesive sense of who we are and how we respond to things. I mean, it's just, that's a very esoteric question maybe, but
But don't
just
you
my
think-
sense of it.
But don't you think that that's true in most big cities? That like if you're in well, I mean if you're in New York, right? You know you're from Bed-Stuy, or you're from Queens, or you're from and your
Yeah, but you know
relationship
what?
with Manhattan is going to be different.
No, I mean, I've been in New York, and I've been in New York for extended periods of time,
Yeah.
and I've seen things happen, and suddenly it's like I'm a New Yorker. It's like I just became a New Yorker, and I knew exactly how to respond to this. And I can't think of the comparative in Toronto.
Right.
Or I've even been in the subway in New York, and something happens, and it's like everyone, I can only say this because I spent a lot of time staying out in Brooklyn, and I've traveled the train to Brooklyn. And at a certain point on the stops, it's a certain group that's on the train. And something happens, and if everyone in that train doesn't look at everyone like, and they know exactly what's going on, it's like they're speaking the same language. And I'm just wondering in Toronto if there is that same comparative. That's what I'm really asking, in terms of that unspokenness around places and spaces of just knowing, like an intuitive, I can't really articulate it any other way.
I mean, I can only, I think for this question, speak from my own experience to say that I don't think there is in the current neighborhood that I live in, for example. I live near Lorinc, but I don't think it would be any different in quite a lot of parts of the city, but maybe in some, I don't know. But I think that my sense of the neighborhood I live in, I've lived there for about 10 years now, is that many of us are moving through quite different, live in the same neighborhood, we're moving through quite a different neighborhood.
Yeah.
So, you know, I've been there around 10 years. There's a fairly large Portuguese population who've been there for much longer than I have, whose stories I've been lucky to learn through some of my work, and now I have a different sense of their history in that neighborhood too. There are young people who have just moved there. There's a homeless shelter 2 blocks from me,
Right.
and who I've also had the privilege of working with the people in that shelter, so I now have a sense of their geography of the neighborhood, really different from mine. So yeah, I don't have a shared sense, which I think is on one hand quite a beautiful thing, but
Yeah, exactly.
requires stories then, like that we really do have to get together and have those conversations and find some way to get beyond a kind of trite conversation, but into some deeper stories around what a place means to us.
Yeah.
I think for us to really get to know each other, and I'm always looking for opportunities to do that,
Yeah.
because I don't think we know so many ways to do that sometimes.
Yeah, I mean, I asked the question not in a negative, because I
Yeah.
think it's actually, it allows for if you look at it that way, then there are opportunities to get to know the spaces and places in ways that you maybe take for granted.
Yeah.
That you're all experiencing this thing together when you're actually not,
You know, yeah.
as much as you think.
I also think that the notion of Toronto as a single thing is fairly new. Like the megacity is 20 years old. Metro was founded in 1954. So, but Metro was really just an administrative creation to distribute property tax. So, you know, these different parts of the city were really, you know, they kind of grew and evolved on their own in a way, right? So perhaps that sense of strong identification with one part or another part is a sort of residual of that. Whereas in a place like New York, I mean, New York went through that amalgamation process like a century plus ago. And so since then, the notion of New York as a thing, you know, sort of gathers momentum. And so you can have a dual set of sort of sensibility of being, you know, I'm from the Upper West Side, but I also am a New Yorker. So it's perhaps it's something like that. And I also think that Toronto Toronto's politics, its local politics and its planning and everything, has placed an enormous amount of emphasis on neighborhoods, more so than in other cities for various reasons. And so I think there's a strong incentive to identify with regions and neighborhoods that is an artifact of planning and, you know, other things.
Yeah, no, that's true. Okay, so to the next question I have here, it's more about, it's kind of a broad question, like what is the current approach, I guess, to conserving these stories and sort of these intangible histories, just from in terms of a heritage and conservation point of view? And do you think that the way that I mean, I know you talked about how there's all these like memory events and people coming together and sharing their stories. Do you think this is something that we need to sort of, I don't want to say institutionalize, that sounds too negative, but you know, to formalize in more concrete ways, that it becomes something that we just start doing? Like from this day forward, we just start conserving histories, telling the stories, thinking about these things in a really dedicated way, as opposed to sort of the haphazard way I feel that we've kind of been going at it for the last how many decades?
Yeah, I mean, I'm really encouraged and excited by the moment that I think we are in, where there's this kind of bubbling up of all sorts of different ways to share these stories and keep these stories alive. A more traditional approach is, you know, historical plaques, for example, or street names, or, you know, so we have some markers in our cityscape. I always like to see more of them, and quite different. You know, I think we could really open up our approach to what those kinds of actual place markers, what those place markers look like, and I think those are, so that's what I think of as a more traditional approach, those kind of place markers. But I think we could blow that wide open and find some other really creative ways to mark place, and I think that's still a valuable thing to do. Because they're just little prompts, and when you lose the buildings, as you were talking about, you know, your whole streetscape can change very quickly. When you lose that, I think it still is lovely to have those prompts, prompts that can take you back to certain memories, or can lead you to a question where you then look into the history of a site. But I also do think these kinds of temporal, like these live events, or live storytelling events, performances, walking tours, etc., are very exciting in my mind. And maybe there is, I would be interested to see a way that could be brought together so that people are aware of them outside of their own little circles and pockets, because I'm very tapped into those types of events. I think I still only know about a very small fraction of them. But I think that's an important way to keep stories in Toronto alive too. And another I'd say is also just embodying cultural practices in sites that we want, where we want a certain cultural heritage to remain alive, is to actually just keep practicing and celebrating and living and exchanging with each other in those sites as well. So.
And I mean also, like, even the word heritage, it's just, you know what I mean? Like, there's such a heaviness to that word. Anytime I think heritage, it's like, oh Lord, where are we going back? Where are we going back to? Right? And I think, you know, and I don't think that's the intention of the word, but it just has this staunchiness to it, and that maybe people feel a little bit like that's boring. I don't want to know about that, when it isn't, right? I mean, you're all here. I hope we're not boring you. It's not boring. It's vital to living in a city and wanting the city to thrive and grow. So even some of the naming around these things, I feel, could change, or...
Yeah, sometimes I think it may be heritage can, for some people, have a connotation of, you know, the sites that are important, or the people who were important. And that isn't the vast majority of us. So, you know, I think it can be a barrier in some cases.
For sure.
So I don't practice conservation, so I'm speaking from a point of ignorance, but so I've learned this from one of the co-editors of the book, who's a young woman named Tatum Taylor, who studied, and I'm just going to tell you what she told me, which is that there are really two ways of thinking about heritage. And there's capital H heritage, which is original, authentic self. And then there's a more organic approach, which is to recognize the incremental changes that take place in spaces and the value of sort of less authentic or subsequent additions and stories as part of the heritage, and stories that aren't sort of associated with the the official history of something. So it's like it's like urban space, which is that it's it accrues, right? All these things sort of pile up, and then you have to be able to know how to see them. I'll just say one other thing, which has to do, it's a very specific thing about the didactic like the didactic materials and the way history, plaques and prompts and so on are used. I don't think we do it especially well, and I hope I'm not offending anyone in the crowd. I think that it's super important to recognize that moving through urban space is to see it in 4 dimensions, with the 4th dimension being time. And so it's so people forget that when you walk down a street, you're actually not. I mean, it appears like a concrete fixed thing, but it's actually moving. It's moving slowly and glacially. So you have to be reminded that time is working on this space. So plaques kind of do that. But I got off the bus the other day at Yonge and Wellington, and there's now a little Heritage Toronto plaque that says, Charles Dickens stayed in the hotel here. And I was like, okay, that's cool, because I like Charles Dickens, and I didn't know there was a hotel there. But it's just like a little round blue plaque. So it did actually sort of prompt memory, but I thought, okay, maybe there's another way of doing it. One way that I really like, which I've seen, is the use of photos that can be juxtaposed in public space against existing streetscapes. And so I do all these boardwalks and where there is nothing to see, wander around the streets around here. And so, when I'm doing them with Ellen Scheinberg and some of the other board people, we always take pictures, archival pictures, and you could show that, this like tumble down house is right here, right? And these people were right here. I mean, that's powerful. I mean, I think that the city has like this amazing resource of archival photographs, which I think are underutilized in the way that you could use them. And I mean, we've spoken about this before, but the importance of images and the way images work on the brain.
It'll be my 3rd book.
Yeah, and so we should use that, right? I mean, Arthur Goss took 23,000 pictures of Toronto, and they're all in the archive, and not one of them is on a city street where you can look at it. So that would be my comment about that.
No, I mean, I always think that living on St. Clair now, we're neighbors, by the way, ish. Every time, each streetcar platform has a photograph and history behind it. And I'm one of those people back in the day where if it was north of Bloor, you were dead to me, basically. I wasn't going north of Bloor, like who lives there? I never went on St. Clair. I just never did. I didn't know what was there. So for me, it's actually been really amazing now living in that neighborhood. Every time I take the streetcar and say I get off at one stop that I don't usually get off, I read I look at the picture and then I read the write-up, and it actually has helped me to feel like I know this neighborhood now that I'm calling home, because I didn't before. And I feel like that's something I wish was done at more of these streetcar lines, because when you start to look at especially as you go north, so much of that used to be something else. Like in a relatively recent history, it was something else, and now it's this thing. And I think, one of the things about it's not just Toronto, I feel like in Canada in general, we don't appreciate our visual culture as much as when you travel to other parts, North America and the world, right? Like, there's so many images that we just don't get to see. Like, so the plaques are great, but wouldn't it be great if there was an image beside it, so that you could really place it in time, like you said, as opposed to this obtuse thing that's just on. I mean, I remember walking, I do Black history. I study Black history. I don't really do Black history. And I remember just happenstance, it was like 5 years ago, I'm walking on King Street East, and to the theater, the Rainbow, oh sorry, I think it's called something else now, theater, whatever it's called. And I'm like, wait a second, I saw a plaque in between two buildings. And I was like, is that Mary Ann Shad Carey? Just like right there? I did a double take, and then I took a picture of it. And then so when I was teaching this Black Canadian Studies course, when I got to that section in the course, I would show the picture that I took, and then I would say to the class, where is this? Where did I take this? And then I would show them the plaque up close, and then a cross the street shot that I took of the buildings. And they would never get it. Not one of them would ever get. And then people were like, oh, Bathurst! They were like screaming at all these intersections. And then I'd say, no, it's King Street East between Church and Jarvis is where it's located. That's because that is the building where she ran her printing press and her paper. And they would be like, oh my God, that's here? I'm like, man, it's week 8. Why are you shocked? But it's that's a side note. What am I teaching you? Why are you not retaining this information? But side note to say is that that is what brought that plaque alive, than them just seeing it on the street. And I think in terms of heritage, if there was more of that, I feel that people would really begin, other than the random Dickens, like, oh, he stayed in a hotel, if there was like more of that, people would really begin to appreciate that a lot of the heritage things that we have in the city are just those random stories, right? It's not this big magnificent thing that you think has to come from somewhere else. It's kind of here, but we're not giving it its fair shine, I guess it's the right word.
I'd also add to that I think in some cases, my only fear about only focusing on images is that there are fewer images for areas north of Bloor, for example. And we were just talking about how many Torontonians their history as of a few years ago is not here. So I love the imagery as well, but I'm also, and it's probably because it's my bias, I work a lot with text and words, but I think that even
putting them together.
Putting them together, and even first person,
Yeah.
even fragments of memories or experiences, I think are very powerful in public space as well, in a different way than, the basic fact that somebody stayed in a certain building or
I mean, it is kind of interesting.
or lived there, which could open up a lot of things, but it's sort of a yes and. I agree with, I think the photos bring something else, and there is this huge treasure trove, and I also think first person can bring a lot as well.
No, you're absolutely right.
So let me just say something about the hotel where Charles Dickens stayed.
Please,
So,
please do.
so I don't know if this specific hotel, but so that's like a cool little fact. Charles Dickens, famous writer, stayed in Toronto. He hated Toronto passionately and wrote very bad things about Toronto. So who else stayed in those downtown hotels? Well, bounty hunters who came up from the United States trying to kidnap African-American refugees and bring them back under the Fugitive Slave Act. So it was very difficult to imagine a plaque that would say that, but there should be one, right?
Right.
And
Yes.
because that's an interesting, like, I'm speaking as a journalist, that's an interesting story, right? But it wouldn't be, that would not be considered plaque-worthy in our conventional understanding of why, what stories should be out there, because we want positive stories, like famous person lived here, famous person worked there.
Which is
right?
often tends to be what we want to conserve and
Right.
preserve,
Yeah.
right? The good stuff.